Thanks, Gloria, and good afternoon, good evening, everyone. I'm sure my talk's probably not going to be exciting as things going on in Washington today, but maybe everybody could use a little bit of something a little bit calmer. A little bit of history of how I got interested in this subject. I was a product of the environmental movement in the late 60s, early 1970s. That's how I got interested first in natural resources and in forestry. In fact, looked back to some old records and I found out I actually was a member of the Wilderness Society as a teenager, back probably in 1969, 1970. I was lucky enough to go to forestry school at University of Maine, and then also have a chance to work here in Vermont for 3 summers during my undergraduate education, working 2 years as a caretaker at Stratton Pond. For those of you that have hiked on the Long Trail Appalachian Trail, know that's just right up the road, right adjacent to Lye Brook Wilderness. And in the third year, I actually worked across the southern Vermont for the club. So I have a long history in this area. And after being gone for almost 40 years in North Carolina, I have an opportunity now to be back here in Vermont, in Danby, at least part-time, but a full-time supporter of the club, the Green Mountain Club, Long Trail, and the forest. What I'd like to talk about today is about wilderness, and more specifically about Lye Brook Wilderness, which is probably 3 miles that way, by the way the bird flies, and some of the history behind how that wilderness area was used prior to its designation as the wilderness and some of the issues it faces today. But before I talk, I'd like to ask you 2 questions, and the first one is, what is wilderness? And I ask this because this has been a central issue for the last century in terms of defining wilderness. Is what is your concept of wilderness? So I'd like to just take a few minutes, and I don't want to put anybody on the spot, but I'd like to just maybe make a list here of some bullets or some words of what people think of as what wilderness is.
Undeveloped land.
Undeveloped land. Okay.
Uninhabited by humans.
Uninhabited by humans. Anybody else? Yes, sir.
One person's wilderness is somebody else's backyard.
Yes. Wilderness is in the eye of the beholder. I remember being up in Edinburgh, Scotland a couple of years ago, and we were in the botanical park there, and right in the middle of the park they had an area that was probably no more than a quarter acre in size, and they called it the wilderness. I took a picture of it. Yes, sir.
How about Vermont?
Vermont as a whole. Okay. Certainly temporally, that was very true. Anybody?
How about the unknown?
The unknown, okay. Anybody else?
Animal habitat.
Animal habitat. Can I add plant to that too? Okay. Any?
Unspoiled.
Unspoiled. Okay. Got a nice list here to start off with, and we'll be able to compare this list to what others have said wilderness was over the past century. So, what is wilderness? I went to Oxford Dictionary, get that simple, very clear definition. and uncultivated, undeveloped, uninhabited, and inhospitable, which is an interesting thought, region. And that's from the definition from the Oxford Dictionary. The Wilderness Act of 1964, which basically was the first actually in the world to declare wilderness, obviously had a definition, and it defines wilderness as, in contrast, in those areas where man and his works dominate the landscape, it is hereby recognized as an area where the earth and its community of life, the ecosystems, are untrammeled by man, where man himself is a visitor who does not remain. And that's actually in the law. So you can see a lot of common thread between your concept of wilderness and what the dictionary says and what has been placed in law for quite a while now. Now, the next question I'd like to ask, and I'll go across the room here, why do we have wilderness? What are the values, the services, the products, the reasons why we might want to have wilderness from your perspective?
Maintain the diversity of species.
Okay, species diversity. Do you happen to be a biologist? Okay.
Carbon sequestration.
Carbon sequestration. Apologize for my spelling here in advance. Yes, sir.
To learn about natural habitat.
A place to learn about natural habitats.
It helps us de-stress.
Helps us
De-stress.
de-stress.
Preserve natural beauty.
Preserve natural beauty. Preserve.
Powerful resources.
What was that again?
Powerful resources.
Sorry.
Resources, lumber.
Resources, okay. Preserve resources?
Carbon storage.
Carbon sequestration, carbon storage. Yes. Can be sequestered, but it can go right back out again. Yes, ma'am.
The earth is a one-time deal.
Okay. One chance. Does that describe it? Okay. Someone?
Recreational opportunities.
Recreation. Okay. So we got a pretty full list here, and it's ranges. Some of the initial reasons, as you'll see, behind setting aside wilderness areas was actually for recreation, a recreation that was in undeveloped areas, recreation that was without automobiles. Certainly, as the concept of wilderness matured and there became a scientific basis, a lot of these more scientific biological, ecological reasons came forward. And always, particularly in the readings, the spiritual rebuilding has always been a key part of why we have wilderness, or why people would like to have wilderness. So, why wilderness? And I've had just a couple quotes here. I think that capture much of what you have said. The wilderness holds the answers to questions more than what we have yet learned to ask. To those devoid of imagination, a blank space on the map is useless waste. To others, it's the most valuable part. Of course, this is one of many quotes from Adolf Leopold. I'm sure some of you have read quite a bit of his work, and he was a big player in the development of wilderness. A more contemporary person who wrote a lot about wilderness is Edward Abbey. Wilderness is not a luxury, but a necessity of the human spirit. And Henry Thoreau in Walking talked about wildness is the preservation of the world. Of course, his concept of wildness was, down in Concord, Massachusetts. He got up to Baxter Park in Maine and didn't really like it there. It was a little bit too wild for him. Okay. So the last question I'll ask, and I won't ask for an answer, but a lot of my talk will help us to really talk about how much wilderness there is today. Does anybody have an idea here in Vermont, if we look at the public land, the federal public land, the Green Mountain National Forest, what % of the national forest is actually in congressionally designated wilderness? Anybody want to take a
Is Lye
stab?
Brook the only one?
What?
Is Lye Brook the only one?
Lye Brook's not the only one. That's a hint. There are 7 other wilderness areas in Vermont.
5%?
5%. Going once, going twice. Anybody want to? I think everyone will be surprised. I was surprised at the number. So, sorry. I'd like to just sort of go through a brief outline, a timeline of sort of wilderness designations in the U.S. I'm not going to spend a lot of time about the politics and the people involved, but here in the Northeast, really the first formally designated wilderness areas really thought to be the Adirondack Park, Forever Wild, and the initial legislation for that was back in 1885. A long time ago, in response to some pretty heavy destructive logging that was being done in northern New York at the time. The federal government got involved in designated wilderness, and it was actually the U.S. Forest Service, and this was in New Mexico, and this was at the request of actually Addo Leopold. He worked in the Gilead National Forest in New Mexico, and an area was actually established formally as a wilderness, not by Congress, but by the Forest Service. It was sort of a 10-year wilderness designation. And then in the late 20s, the Forest Service actually started to identify primitive areas. And this was in response that there was a lot of give and take between the National Park Service and the U.S. Forest Service, and anytime there was a beautiful area, the Park Service made a grab for the land, and the Forest Service didn't particularly like that, so they said, well, maybe we could designate primitive areas and keep that under our control. So certainly that interagency rivalry goes back a long ways. The Wilderness Society itself was established in 1935. Some of the initial ideas for that society actually was started probably 10 years before that or even more. I think it's important to point out that 4 of the original 8 founding members of the Wilderness Society were foresters. So this is what you'll find in the forestry profession. People think about foresters, we cut trees and that's all we do. But in forestry, there range from people that are very utilitarian, people that are quite conservationists in mind, utilitarian, a mix, and then some that are, very strongly in terms of preservation resources. And the forestry profession has always had that range. And, I sit in about the center of it and have been very comfortable for that for my career. Addo Leopold, well-recognized forester and wildlife. He's called, in fact, the father of wildlife management. Benton Mackay. I used to say McKay, but in my reading it should be Mackay. Many of you have probably heard of him not only in relationship to wilderness, but he is sort of the father of the Appalachian Trail. The Appalachian Trail was supposedly conceived when he was hiking on Stratton Mountain, again, right near here. One of the real big reasons behind the establishment of the Wilderness Society had nothing to do about science, nothing to do about ecology, but it was a real concern of the original 8 about how cars were really beginning to impose upon the wild areas of the U.S. Roads were being built everywhere. And if you look at some of the numbers of the visits to national parks, visits to national forests, the automobile use from like 1925 to 1935, it's unbelievable, the annual increase. So in fact, there was a concern that all the roadless areas would be gone. Say the Forest Service came through with several regulations. The Forest Service thought, wilderness area needed to be really big, and so they had one designation where it was greater than 100,000 acres, and then another designation they called wild areas that were between 5,000 and 100,000. And finally, almost 30 years after the Wilderness Society was established, Congress passed the Wilderness Act of 1964. The first initial legislation for the Wilderness Act was introduced into Congress in 1955. It took 9 years, many acts of Congress that weren't passed, a lot of back and forth before this first act was passed, and it had very strong bipartisan support. And LBJ was the one that signed it into law. It only applies to federal land, doesn't apply to private land, doesn't apply to state land. It's land managed by the Forest Service, by the National Park Service, and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and also the Bureau of Land Management. That leaves a lot of other federal land, particularly that land that is managed by some of our military branches, that does not fall underneath the wilderness regulations. And in 1964, only 3 areas east of the Mississippi were found to qualify as wildernesses. And they were Great Gulf in New Hampshire. Some of you may have hiked there. Shining Rock down in North Carolina, and also Linville Gorge qualified. There were no areas here in Vermont that were qualified under the Act as being untrammeled by man, and that's one of the key issues. So, because of that, there was a real strong desire to have wilderness areas designated here east of the Mississippi. And there was a lot of back and forth between particularly the Forest Service, which managed a lot of land east of the Mississippi River, and what sort of land would be suitable or fit underneath the wilderness criteria. So sometime in the late 60s, early 1970s, the Forest Service came out with a review of all their roadless areas, and they said, sorry folks, nothing east of the Mississippi qualifies as wilderness. Well, folks in Congress said, hey, wait a second, that's not our intent. You're trying to put too pure of a definition on what wilderness is, that can't be touched by man. So again, a lot of going back and forth, and certainly one of our senators, George Atkin, former governor and senator from Vermont, was very important in fact, getting the Eastern Wilderness Act passed, and that was in 1975. And Lye Brook and Bristol Cliffs, which is north, were the first wilderness identified here in Vermont, and there were several wildernesses in New Hampshire, and of course all the way down the East Coast. Following the establishment of the Eastern Wilderness Act in 1975, the Forest Service had a roadless area review and identified a huge amount of land, almost 60 million acres, 30% of the national forest that at the time was roadless and might be suitable for designation as wilderness. Today, when we look at just the federally or congressionally declared designated wilderness, we have over 100 million acres. That represents 17% of the federal land is in congressionally designated wilderness. And I think most of us would feel that if it's congressionally designated, that's pretty well locked up. I think there's been some changes and some questions of, even with Congress, how well locked up some of this land may be. But that's certainly what it represents today on a nationwide basis. And of course, a lot of that's in Alaska. Okay, the Eastern Wilderness Act. Well, let me talk a little bit more of that because that's what's really relevant for us here in Vermont and for Lye Brook Wilderness. It was in large part a response to the U.S. Forest Service purity interpretation, where the Forest Service said, hey guys, there's nothing east of the Mississippi. And some congressmen, including George Atkin, said, no, that's not what we had in mind. Certainly there are areas that qualify. What it turns out is that basically the definition was changed. So instead of being untrammeled by man, the thought was that it would be mostly roadless. There would be no improved roads in these areas. And unlike much of Vermont, these areas were not to have been cleared for agriculture, whether it was for pastures or for row crops. So they may have been forested areas that had been cut, but if they certainly were moving back to the natural state, they would qualify. And one of the big things moving forward in time is that there was no motorized, no mechanized travel or equipment that's allowed in wilderness areas. The focus of both the Wilderness Act of 1964 and the Eastern Wilderness Acts of 75 was really human-centric. You read through the act, it was focused, as I say here, it wasn't focused on ecosystems or biodiversity, some things as an ecologist that would interest me, but it was really focused on for the use and enjoyment of the American people in such a manner that will leave them unimpaired. Particularly here in the East, where we have a lot of our population, there was a lot of concern that we needed to set aside these areas where people could go and be in wilderness and recreate or relax or just be able to have that spiritual renewal. The lands were to be managed to promote and perpetuate the wilderness character of the land and specific values of, look at this, solitude, physical and mental challenge, scientific study, inspiration, and primitive recreation. So the ideas of solitude, physical, and mental challenge were all part of that. One of the biggest issues that the Forest Service is dealing with now is with some of the ADA regulations. If there are any structures in the wilderness, should they be ADA accessible? So they're interesting things like that. What was not really considered in the designation of wilderness were they representative of important ecosystems? Were they areas with really high biodiversity? In many cases, they were very beautiful scenic areas. In addition, in many cases, they held very important ecosystems. What was not considered back in 1975, although we had the Clean Air Act being done at the time, was how issues such as acid deposition, global change, climatic change, invasive species, how these factors may influence wilderness areas. So that was the Eastern Wilderness Act of 1975. With that, again, Lye Brook and Bristol Cliffs were established. There were several subsequent follow-ups. In 1984, there was the Vermont Wilderness Act that added several more wilderness areas. 2006, the New England Wilderness Act that added some more. Today, in Vermont, we have 8 wilderness areas. It amounts to a little over 100,000 acres. And this represents 24% of the land that is managed by the Green Mountain National Forest. That's not just within the proclamation boundaries, but what is owned by we the people. So actually it is I found it to be a surprisingly large number. And I think we can be proud of that in Vermont. So just to give you an idea of where the wilderness areas are, in case you're not familiar, starting from the south and heading up, we have, hit the wrong button, sorry. We have the Aitken Wilderness, which is a small wilderness area just south of Route 9. The Glastonbury Wilderness, which is actually quite large on Glastonbury Mountain, which is north of Route 9. Then Lye Brook Wilderness here, which is just east of us. We have two wildernesses, Peru Peak and Big Branch. They're side by side. For those of you who have hiked up in that area, the Long Trail, Appalachian Trail actually goes right through the split here in the middle, as well as a snowmobile trail. So there were some very specific reasons why this is not one wilderness, why in fact it was split into two. Then further up north, also still on the National Forest, you have the Battelle Wilderness, Breadwolf Wilderness, and then Bristol Cliffs. So those are the wilderness areas here in Vermont. How many of you have had a chance to visit any of these wilderness areas? Wow, excellent, excellent. Most people, Lye Brook Wilderness, since it's close at hand. Have anybody been down here to the Aitken Wilderness? Okay, few. It's there's no real trails into that wilderness. That's one of, along with Bristol Cliffs and Aitken, is two of the wilderness areas that I have not visited. And Lye Brook Wilderness, which is again right in our backyard, is over 18,000 acres. It's a nice piece of property. And taking a look here, of course, this is where we are in Manchester. Lye Brook Falls comes here. The falls are actually right outside the wilderness boundary. And the Appalachian Trail right here goes through the eastern part of the wilderness, and then what historically was the Appalachian Trail went by Bourne Pond and then up, and now that's not the Appalachian Trail anymore. It's a side trail, and there's still several side trails in there. Looking from Google Earth, I tried to match up in terms of size, the map. And of course, here's the highway, and then it's a very broad, almost flat plateau. And I say almost flat because if you look at it from Stratton Mountain, this is Stratton Mountain looking west towards Equinox. You see Stratton Pond, which is right at the edge of the wilderness. You cannot see Bourne Pond, which is actually in the wilderness. And it's just a very high plateau, high for Vermont, about 2,500 feet. It was high enough and the soils were shallow and poor enough that it was never used for either grazing or for other agricultural use like farming. So it had basically been very isolated and stayed as forest, and still is forest. So for those of you who have hiked up Stratton Mountain and actually had a view from the fire tower, which is not every day of the week, this is the kind of view that you can get out looking west right into the wilderness area. So, Lye Brook Wilderness, it is not roadless. And you can quickly see that. You just pull out a topo map. This is just out of my Garmin, and all the trails and old roads that went up into the wilderness areas, the Stratton Pond, here's Bourne Pond. Most of these are in fact old rail lines that over the years may or may not have been for roads. And this is one of the big reasons why Lye Brook wasn't originally designated as a wilderness area, because it was not roadless. It certainly had been touched by man. So a quick look at the timeline for Lye Brook. And I'm being very European-centric here. I don't have a lot of information about what happened in Lye Brook before us. Certainly Dave Lacey, who for many years worked with the Forest Service, has some good information in some areas of forest in terms of Native American use, but I'm not sure about Lye Brook. Some of the original utilitarian efforts that went on in Lye Brook were for lye production. What is lye? Lye back in those days was basically, you took trees, you burned them, you took the ash, leached the ash out, and the potassium hydroxide, which is lye, would be readily leached from the ash material. Guess what? That's how Lye Brook got its name. Was from that initial use. And that probably was pretty active from the 1820s to 1840s. By 1850, they figured out how to make lye from potassium chlorite, mirror of potash, from a chemical reaction, so they no longer were in the woods trying to make it from ash. Immediately following that, there was a small community built up on the end of what is the Rootfield Road. It's sort of in the northern part now of what is Lye Brook Wilderness. And in the late 1860s, early 1870s, there's records of there being actually 3 sawmills up in that area. Those sawmills were followed quickly by a real emphasis on charcoal production. Charcoal production probably started, back in the 1820s, 1830s, but in terms of a more industrial charcoal production way, it really reached its peak in the 1880s, and actually here in Vermont, from many of the wilderness areas, all down, up and down the Green Mountains, much of that charcoal went to the steel producers in Pennsylvania. They used charcoal rather than coke, and again, around the turn of this last century, converted from charcoal to using coke. Interesting enough, I found a reference where here in Bennington County, by the 1870s, there were no white-tailed deer. It's kind of hard to believe that now, particularly, trying to keep them out of my garden. But there were actually four deer released at Bourne Pond, which is now within Lye Brook, in 1875, and they were from Pennsylvania, and that's really what it was. They were released there because that was thought to be more wild, more wilderness, and that certainly represents a part of where our current deer population comes from. So I would say up until the turn of the last century, the impact of forestry or of utilization was very light on the land. As I say, it was pretty isolated. It was difficult to get up there on the plateau. That all changed when Rich Lumber Company established a big sawmill down here in Manchester. And from 1914 to 1990, the Rich Lumber Company and the Lye Brook Railroad, which they owned, that went up into Lye Brook, on an annual basis, they removed about 16 million board feet of just spruce a year. Just to put that in perspective, that's probably equal to clear cutting roughly about 1,000 or 1,200 acres a year. I'll show you some pictures which clearly show much of the land was pretty much clear cut, because if it was spruce, it was cut. They purchased the property assuming that there was going to be about 15 years of supply of spruce. In fact, there was 5 years. And right after they realized the spruce was about out, interestingly, the sawmill burned down. So, in any way, 16 million board feet. It's a lot of wood. But today's high-speed sawmills, some of the sawmills some of my clients have, would produce 20 times that much wood in a year. So some of the big high-speed sawmills in the south, or big up in Maine or New Brunswick, that are cutting spruce, would be sawing 20 times that much in a single year. Rich Lumber Company, Lye Brook Railroad, everything fell to pieces in 1990. About that same time, a little bit before, the Green Mountain Club actually cut the Long Trail. In fact, the Long Trail, as it goes across Stratton Mountain and into Bourne Pond, was cut by folks from Bennington about 1913, 1914, into that era. And of course, it's there to the present time. The Sweezy family, which is a family here that's been in Manchester area for many, many years, owned quite a bit of what is now Lye Brook, and certainly logged it in the 1920s. Again, at the time, there was no spruce left, so much of that was for hardwoods, which were left on the sites. Sweezy family and others sold the land to the Forest Service in the 1930s. Yes, sir.
My grandfather came here from Wanakina with Rich Lumber.
Yep. And Rich Lumber Company came from New York. Their previous sawmills had been in New York, and prior to that, Pennsylvania, so they had come to Vermont. So the Forest Service basically purchased much of the land which is now in Lye Brook and in here in southern Vermont in the 1930s. And what's interesting enough, Chris Sweezy was the last person to actually log the area. By the mid-1950s, there had been plenty of regrowths, and there was a U.S. Forest Service timber contract in over a 3-year period. He cut 3.5 million board feet, or sorry, 3.5 million board feet were removed in that harvest. By the early 1960s, the area was receiving a lot of recreational use. And the Forest Service gave it a backwoods area designation, which basically shut down logging in the area and kept it roadless. In the 1960s, there was a real big push, particularly from folks here in Manchester, to have some more sophisticated outdoor recreation. Hapgood Campground was put in, and also there were plans to put in a campground right at Branch Pond. In fact, there's a wonderful gravel road going right up to Branch Pond now, and this was part of the 1960s. Again, as I talked about earlier, there was the Wilderness Act of '64, the Forest Service saying we don't have anything on the east, back and forth, and so in 1975, Lye Brook, a big part of Lye Brook was designated as wilderness. And then throughout the 80s and into the 90s, there was a huge amount of what I call management conflicts. The Forest Service, this land was designated as wilderness. You know, based on their standards, it was not wilderness. So there was a lot of discussion, a lot of argument within the Forest Service and outside the Forest Service on what management, if anything, should be done to give it more wilderness character. And the folks here in Manchester, particularly back in the early 1990s, were actively involved in a lot of those discussions. By that time, the Forest Service was having public hearings. And it's really interesting to read some of those transcripts in terms of different people's thought of what wilderness meant to them. So, a few pictures courtesy of the Vermont Historical Society, and they have a wealth of pictures of Lye Brook. Yep, good. This is a siding up just north of Bourne Pond. You get a really good idea that any standing hardwood was left and all the spruce was cut and it was piled up along the railroad. That then made it, to the mill and was turned into spruce lumber. And that spruce lumber, this basically fed the war effort. And certainly the 1917, 1980. Many of you know that, or may not know that a lot of the early airplanes were made of spruce. So I'm sure quite a bit of spruce from here maybe went into some of those early airplanes during the First World War. Very good quality spruce. Bourne Pond, and for those that have hiked up there, this is just right on the southeast corner of the pond. There were logging camps here. You can see here, 1915 in the winter. Basically, A lot of the cutting, a lot of the movement of wood was done in the wintertime. Once the ground froze up, back then, mid-December through mid-March. Nowadays, we're lucky if the ground freezes up by early January. So we're already seeing the effects of climate change. But, these camps, not the best place to stay, but in fact, these camps served as trail shelters for many years, probably up until the 1930s, 1940s on the Long Trail Appalachian Trail. And this is just walking up the railroad along the west side of the pond, and you can see the spruce next to the pond. In fact, some of these spruce are still there because that's the island within Bourne Pond that was not cut. And all the beautiful spruce logs, at least from a forester, I see beautiful spruce logs wrapped up there. And for those of you that have climbed to Lye Brook Falls and a little bit beyond, there's actually a switchback that the railroad needed to use because it was so steep. This is what the switchback looked like, back in 1916. I'm not sure the exact date of the photograph. This is the bridge that went over sort of the northern part of the Lye Brook. It's a huge trestle. I did find the remains of the trestle. The only thing that I found were a couple stone abutments at the bottom. Otherwise, it's completely grown up. I'd show you a picture of it, but all it shows is woods. So this is the same area right here. Where the switchback is. This is the exact same area where that switchback is today. That's what it looks like. You can go actually see that cut rock face is still there. And you can follow the sort of the flat line, but it's certainly all grown up. You notice the species grown up in a lot of hemlocks, and that's an issue that unfortunately we're facing now here in the future. Again, this is just north of Bourne Pond. I've got some pictures of what this site looks like today. Right along, again, Bourne Pond. Notice these weren't normal railroad ties. What did they use? Birch. And anybody who has used birch knows it rots pretty quickly. So this was, definitely, temporary, not put there in terms of permanence. And you look at that area now, this is that exact same area. And this is the what's now called the Branch Pond Trail that goes north of Bourne Pond. You look very closely, you can actually see some of the remains of the old ties. And I actually remember first time I hiked in this area back in the early 1970s, actually finding a couple spikes still. I haven't found any spikes recently, but certainly back then there were still some spikes. And again, just a close-up look of, you can actually see a well-formed tie there. And just another look at, this is how the rail bed looks today. It's a beautiful hiking trail, kind of wide open on the side. The unfortunate part about this trail is also very muddy most of the year for those of you that have hiked in that area. There's a good reason why spruce grows up there. Because much of the soil, much of the site is quite wet. And then just another picture of what has grown up. Some of this area, although it's not very good records, the species mix now in many cases is white birch and yellow birch, which to me clearly as a forest ecologist indicates there had been fire. And there's no doubt that the terrain probably there were small fires, which then for light-seeded species such as birch came in. And now in many of these areas you have these beautiful white birch stands that are pushing now 90 to 100 years old. And beginning to come apart because they're over mature. There's an area that's called Lye Brook Meadow. It's pretty wet. Was a siding there. This is a picture back in 1960, 1970. All the logs piled up there in the meadow. This is what that exact spot looks like today. And my old college roommate and hiking buddy is standing on what was the the railroad line. You can actually follow the railroad line through that bog without getting your feet wet. It's quite interesting. So, an important part of Lye Brook before it became wilderness was the Long Trail and subsequently the Appalachian Trail. The Long Trail and the Appalachian Trail now passes through 4 of the wilderness areas, and the Long Trail north of where the AT takes off at Shelburne Pass is also in the Battelle and Breadloaf Wilderness. There are also many side trails. The wildernesses that we have, Lye Brook Wilderness, Peru Peak, Big Branch Wilderness a little bit north of here, really accessible for day hiking. You climb up the plateau, up in the ridge, you climb about 1,500, 2,000 feet, and you'll be right in the wilderness areas. So they're very, very accessible by many of these side trails. Long Trail Guide, for many years had the Long Trail and Appalachian Trail going through Bourne Pond. Just some pictures from the past. This is from a picture from 1921 of a hiker walking across an old log bridge where the railroad ties, the rails are gone, but they're using that old bridge on the hiking trail. Then a little bit of history. Back when I was working on the trail in '73, this was a bridge that the club had across the Windhall River, and there's a much nicer bridge, not at the same location, but where the trail was relocated now, going across the Windhall River. The interesting thing is, for those of you that have hiked this section of trail, on the north side of this bridge is actually where the Lye Brook Railroad ended. There's actually, the rail bed comes right out by where that bridge is, and in fact probably crossed the Windhall River in about the same place. Right now within the wilderness, the club maintains what's called Douglas Shelter. It used to be called Sweezy Shelter after the Sweezy family. I remember staying at that shelter back in 1972 when I hiked the trail and spent the night with porcupines, which were a lot more prevalent back then. Now that the Long Trail, Appalachian Trail no longer goes by Bourne Pond or by the shelter, that's the Branch Pond Trail. And this happened in the 1990s, late 1980s, early 1990s, as a result of the Forest Service saying that the Long Trail, Appalachian Trail was incompatible with wilderness. Of course, I might say the Green Mountain Club had a real problem with that, because the Green Mountain Club had always called the Long Trail the footpath through the wilderness. And we said, how can our long-standing footpath through the wilderness not be appropriate for the wilderness? So in fact, there was a lot of tension at the time between the club leadership and the Forest Service in terms of what was going to be maintained and continued within these wilderness areas. And ultimately the Forest Service said, we're moving the trail out of the wilderness and taking down the shelters. I don't think the club has ever gotten over that. Certainly I haven't. And now, basically, some beautiful shelter locations are been replaced by what I call the mulching privy thrones. As for those of you who've been up at South Bourne and North Bourne campsites, you see these quite interesting small structures to protect the resource, but not to protect your human dignity. You get a good view. Okay, so in regard to this, the conflict or the development of how should wilderness be managed, there was a young fellow, he was young back in 1995, he actually wrote a thesis for his bachelor's degree. Very, very interesting piece of work. I have a copy, a PDF, if anybody is interested. And he interviewed a lot of people. He interviewed Chris Sweezy. He interviewed a lot of other people that worked for the Forest Service at the time, worked for the club at the time, and has a really good documentation of sort of this back and forth that was going on in the 80s and 90s about Lye Brook Wilderness. And this is Robert Pravnik, who's passed away several years ago. He, in fact, was my boss when I worked on the forest in when was that? 1975. I reported to him. He was responsible for forest recreation at the time here in Manchester, in the Manchester district. The hikers' effect on Bourne Pond disturbed the Forest Service. There was no doubt about that. It was like a cattle barn, Bob recalled, with 50 or 60 people camped along the lake shores and, going back. And it was a sea of tents, and, the Forest Service felt that this was not appropriate for a wilderness area. During the 1978-79 season, the Forest Service said the AT-LT must be moved. It took a while to get it to moved. And then back in the 80s, then the Forest Service eliminated the 2 shelters that were there. What's interesting is Bob then went on to say, removing the trail was also partly an act of retribution. For many people in the Forest Service still resented the imposition of problematic wilderness areas on their timber stands. There was a feeling, if you want wilderness, fine, we'll give you wilderness. And so that gives you a flavor for some of the animosity, some of the struggles that existed back in the late 70s, early 1980s. I'm pleased to say that doesn't exist anymore, and the Forest Service has embraced wilderness. In fact, maybe embraced it too much. And there's certainly the club, the Forest Service, and others have a very good working relationship. To me, one of the interesting things as a forester and as a forest manager, one of the interesting things to me is about how do you manage wilderness, or do you manage wilderness? Do you just let it go? And certainly, there's some people said you designate it and walk away, and whatever happens, happens. Well, that's not what happens here in the U.S., not on Forest Service land, certainly not on Park Service land. And I just pulled this up. This is the Forest Service Wilderness Regulations Manuals. And does anybody here work for the Forest Service? I'll try not to be critical here. But the Forest Service, like a lot of foresters, have J personalities. They are very organized. They are very structured. They like to do things by the letter of the law, the purity argument. They don't like to leave too many things to anyone's imagination. So there's very detailed rules, regulations on what should be done. And if they don't have rules and regulations what should be done, they have very detailed processes of how you should decide it. And this is the Wilderness Regulation Management. It is 55 pages long. 55 pages long. And they're adding to it every day. So that's how they manage the wilderness. So I'd like to wrap up here with just a few comments on some of the challenges that I think are facing our concepts and our values of wilderness. A big one is invasive species. Here in Vermont, right sitting on our border, we have hemlock woolly adelgid. That is unfortunately going to wipe out the hemlock stands. And if you walk up Lye Brook, in the areas that were cut, the predominant forest species there is hemlock. So that is going to change. We have emerald ash borer. Much of the better sites, the beautiful hardwood forest we have, particularly at that 2,500 foot elevation, there's a large component of white ash. That's going to be gone in 10 or 15 years. So there's going to be huge changes caused by us that will impact upon certainly the ecology and the biology of the system. One of the other big issues, not only for wilderness, but for any forest management area, is drones. How many of you own a drone? Anybody own a drone here? Anybody have children or grandchildren that own drones? Yeah, okay. So I don't own a drone, but certainly a lot of my clients do, and we're using drones to make assessments of forests. But the interesting thing is the Forest Service doesn't control the airspace over the wilderness area. Who does?
FAA.
FAA, exactly. Now, you cannot land your drone in the wilderness, but you certainly can take off and fly over the wilderness if you're, outside. And certainly, as I talked about, a lot of the wilderness areas are readily accessible. And if you're thinking about solitude, getting away from it, those don't quite match with drones going over. The other thing is mountain bikes. We now have bikes, fat tire bikes, mountain bikes, that allow us to get back into the woods very quickly. Mountain bikes are not allowed in the wilderness. That's awfully controversial because it's not a motorized transport, but it is a mechanized transport. And one thing I noticed as you walk the old rail lines in Lye Brook, and they're nice graded. Boy, for a mountain biker, if this was cleared off, this would just be a gorgeous place to ride your mountain bike. And I'm sure I'm not the only one that has thought about that. Overuse. Certainly back in the late 70s and early 80s, the Forest Service was very concerned about overuse. And in fact, there was a time that permits were required to camp, to stay overnight in Lye Brook Wilderness. That's not the case now. You can just go walk up there. We are seeing, the Green Mountain Club is seeing a resurgence of trail use. Sort of went through a lull, in the late 90s and the early part of this century. But certainly if we look at our hiker use, it's doubling in some places. So again, that may be something that is of concern. And in any backcountry area, particularly in Vermont, where we have shallow soils, waste disposal now is a huge issue. How many outhouse privy holes can you dig before you run out of appropriate locations? And when you get up onto the Lye Brook Plateau, there are really not many appropriate locations. So the outhouse that I showed you was a composting outhouse, aerobic composting. Another big issue is global change, climate change. Yes, I'm a forester. I believe climate is changing. I've seen things with my own eyes that suggest there has been change. That's going to affect the wilderness area. We're going to see changes in species composition. Invasive species and climate change together, to me, really scare me because we can't predict what our plant communities are going to like. And then finally, the third question I'll ask again, how much wilderness is enough? There are now people out there in Congress saying we have too much wilderness. Some of these areas should be changed back and opened up for gas and oil exploration, for extraction of timber, or for more motorized recreational uses. So again, I hope that's not a huge problem, as there still seems to be bipartisan support for wilderness. But again, that's certainly a political, social issue that I view as a challenge to wilderness. So I've talked about Lye Brook. I've talked about the congressionally designated wilderness. Someone mentioned Vermont as wilderness. So here in Vermont, I think, and a lot of other people think, that we have a lot of other wilderness in addition to what Congress has applied. And if we look right here in our neighborhood, where we have private conserved properties, we have the Equinox Preserve, we have Merck Forest, we have Smoky House up in Danby that owns about 5,000 acres. Some of these forests are managed a little bit for forest products, but in general, much of the land is left in a natural state, in a state that most of us would be able to have considerable solitude and be able to get away from it. Certainly here in Vermont, the Vermont Land Trust has been instrumental in conserving, not necessarily preserving, but conserving thousands probably tens of thousands of acres now of forest land. Here in the state, there is a Northeast Wilderness Trust. We don't hear much about them because they're up in the Northeast Kingdom. And then, of course, here in Vermont, we're blessed with lots of state forests, lots of town forests, lots of state parks, a lot of wildlife management areas that, in many regards, are Vermont wilderness. So I think we're blessed to have, you know, quite a legacy here within our state. So I just wanted to recommend some reading, some sources of material, and I have copies over here. First off, this is an excellent book. It was written by Paul Sutter. He's a historian. I think this was written 4 or 5 years ago now. Driven Wild. It's the history about how of the folks behind the Wilderness Society and the role of the modern automobile in really actually pushing the wilderness to become established. I found it very interesting with the, the 100th anniversary of the Park Service, that Subaru was a sponsor of that. I was reading this book at that time, and I said, oh man, that's quite a bit of parallels here, you know, in terms of automotive use. Paul is an excellent writer. I had a chance to hear him speak a couple times. This is a book some of you may have seen. It's Rails in the North Woods. It talks mostly about New York and Pennsylvania, but there is a chapter on Rich Lumber Company and the Lye Brook, and it has maps of where the rail lines are. I've GPSed most of the rail lines, and those maps are not quite accurate, but you know, they give you an idea where they are. And then a very interesting book that's called 200 Years of Soot and Sweat, and it talks about the iron, charcoal, and lime industries here in Vermont. And there's very, very detailed information of where you can find the old charcoal kilns up here in Lye Brook and other areas.
At the peak of that industry, how much of the state was deforested?
Probably very little, because it actually was a short period of time. It was a period of probably of about 10 years. And our good friend Silas Griffith up in Danby, who made his fortune with charcoal, and that was in most of the area now that it's in Peru Peak, and the Breadwolf Wilderness was cut over. It wasn't clear cut. They were looking for big trees to put in the charcoal kilns. Thank goodness it only lasted for 10 years, because if it had lasted longer, it would have decimated the forest in the state.
What about the sheep?
The sheep in these areas that we're talking about, the land was never cleared for sheep. Sheep were, there may have been, a couple lots, but those are part of the 15% of the state that was not in sheep were in what is now these wilderness areas. They were just so inaccessible. Soils were not appropriate for sheep, and the like. So it's quite interesting. And as I say, this was a very interesting work. This was a bachelor's thesis from Amherst College, Matthew Siegel. I chased him down with Google. He's now a medical doctor, I think, in the Portland, Maine area. But this, like 130, 140 pages, just a really interesting read. He went back and was able to get to quite a number of primary sources of information, and got some tape recordings. So very good information on Lye Brook. So here are the readings. We can post this PowerPoint online, or I can send them to you if you're interested. If you're interested in not necessarily Vermont, but how climate change may be affecting our forest, there's a really excellent book by some of my forestry colleagues called The Changing Nature of the Maine Woods. And basically describe how the forests in Maine have changed from when the last glacier left about 12,000 years ago to date, and how man and how climate have been responsible for those changes. So it's a very interesting and accessible read. Finally, some concluding remarks. 100 years later, after the Lye Brook Railroad and Rich Lumber Company closed down, there's still strong evidence of past use there. The old railroad beds, the charcoal kiln clearings, and the brick associated with those charcoal kilns. And then the fact that we have white birch, yellow birch forest developing with a spruce understory, indicative of the fires and the close to clear cutting that was done at the time. And again, to me, from a manager's perspective, what's going to happen to our wilderness areas with the invasive species with global change?
Rich Lumber Company actually built Richville.
Yes.
All those houses.
Yes.
They actually had a store.
That are still there. Yeah. It's again like a lot of the company-owned communities. They came in, they built the sawmill, and then built the quarters for the employees, and you can see where people were in the pecking order.
A watchman's clock that they took around to all the different mill locations and had to stamp in as a watchman for Rich Lumber Company here in town.
Yep.
The Historical Society has it now.
So, questions?
You haven't mentioned fire at all.
Right. I have found no written record of fire. Although looking at the forest ecosystems, I know there has to have been fire, because of without a fire there would not be the white birch, the amount of white birch that's up there. But certainly there's not the records like there are in the White Mountains of where there was huge fires and the story. So if anybody knows of where there might be some records, I haven't looked back to some of the newspapers in the early 20s to see what there might be. But certainly in this area, in the Northeast Kingdom, there are good records of fires. But here, I have not seen it. Yes, ma'am.
Was there a rail line quite close to the trailhead, the Lye Brook trailhead?
Yes. In fact, the rail line went right up there. So where the...
When you walk, fairly soon after you start out, you come to this raised area where it's completely flat.
Yes.
And free from the roots and rocks which plague the entire rest of it.
Yeah.
And I thought that either was a road, but I couldn't understand why they would raise it for a railroad.
So the Lye Brook Trail today, going up to the falls, there are a few places where it's actually on the old rail bed. Most of the rail bed is actually closer down to the stream. So if you get off the current trail, you can actually follow the old, and it's easy to follow the old rail bed up because it's smooth and clear. And the other thing, it has actually ditches on each side of it, so you can actually tell where that rail bed is.
Actually, there's at least 3 rails going side by side up from the valley and all the way up.
Yeah. And it's absolutely amazing. You see some of those grades and what came down. Going up was easy. It was coming down with the load of logs behind you. That was the real difficulty.
When they abandoned the railroad, they took the rails with them?
They took the rails with them, and I don't remember. I remember reading somewhere where they were sold to, but all the other structures were left in place and just decayed over time.
It's easy to see where they used to lay them. It's like a corduroy.
Corduroy, yeah, like on what we do for trail work now, it's corduroy, but it's there, and particularly by Bourne Pond, on the west side of Bourne Pond, a very, very, very clear rail bed.
You have another question?
Sure.
Have you been up there since the slide?
On the
Lye Brook Trail?
no, I have not been up there since the slide.
If you take the side spur to the falls, just after the slide, if you go straight down in the valley, there's a huge ruin down there. Nobody seems to know what is doing there, what the building was for, and who built it, and so on. It's about 40 by 50.
Is that the
Big stone
commissary?
wall.
There was a commissary up there.
Well, this is a huge building. Is that a commissary? What was
Yeah,
it
Lye
used-
Brook had, the Rich Lumber Company had a commissary up there for all the loggers that were up there where they could go get supplies while they were on the mill.
Maybe that's it. Because I've been asking historians and so on, nobody seems to know.
I've got a little more information on that. If you look at the Bennington County maps dating back to 1856, right in that location, there's a building that's labeled Manchester Lumber Company. And if you look at the Beers Atlas from 1869, it shows some other name there. And near that building that you're talking about, I've been there several times, there is the remains of an old lumber mill. It's barely perceptible that it's there. But I think Rich Lumber Company reused that building.
That foundation, yeah. Yeah, in my reading, again, looking back at the old maps, there's evidence that there were sawmills up Lye Brook and actually used Lye Brook as a source of power, probably from in the 1850s, 1860s. Before, long before Rich Lumber Company was up there. Rich Lumber Company was trying to get the spruce at the high elevations or higher elevations.
Do you think if we were looking in another wilderness area, the same sort of pattern would exist of its having been developed for lumber?
Here in Vermont, yes. And if we look at Glastonbury, where Glastonbury Wilderness was, and at one time there was a hotel, go up there, going up what was a railroad line that is, then a gravel road, and now back as wilderness.
There was a population there, wasn't there?
There was a town of Glastonbury. There was a town of Glastonbury, yeah.
Now 0 people.
Yeah. And the same thing if you go up Forest Road 10, if anybody's been into the Little Rock Pond area, and then of course south of that big branch in Peru Peak Wilderness, Silas Griffin was up there. There was charcoaling up there, and then there was a lot of logging up in that area. In fact, up in that area, again, just like Lye Brook, a lot of the logging, in fact, I can remember areas that are now in Peru Peak Wilderness were being logged when I worked on the trail in the mid-1974, 1975. So some of the last logging was being done up there before those were designated wildernesses in the 1980s.
Why only spruce?
Because that's what they did. That's what they used. They were a lumber company. Now there were a lot of other folks that would use hardwoods, but for at the time what was a big high-speed sawmill, they were focused on basically a commodity. A lot of that spruce, as I said, was probably used in the war effort. Just as we use today, those of us that build, you build your house, you want SPF lumber, and that's spruce fir pine. Most of it's, the best is spruce. Very, very nice to build with. Light and strong. Any other questions?
How did it get to be named Peru?
Peru? From the town of Peru, and is anybody from Peru? No, because obviously Peru, Peru,
It was Bromley before it was Peru.
yeah, and then there's Peru Peak. So obviously some politician. Okay. Anything else? Well, thanks very much.
Thank you.